always like to start with zhuzhing the hair. Hello everyone, Chawan again. And today I'm so happy to be talking more about Eastern esoteric occult thought. And I don't know if you guys have noticed, but don't let the blonde hair fool you. I am Asian. So it's always a pleasure for me to talk to people who can tell me more about Eastern traditions. And today my guest is Swami Anand Nisarg.
That is the name, the initiate name that I received when I was initiated into a particular lineage at not the start, but kind of the midpoint of my spiritual journey, because I had started out as somebody, when I started university, I got interested in Western occultism and Western magic, and I did all that first. And I liked it, and it was useful, and it caused changes in me, it caused growth in me. But I could tell, because I was also doing this as part of a history degree in kind of the history of the occult, that there was stuff that was missing from it, that some of the developments of history in the West had led to a number of gaps appearing in what would be the formula of self-transformation in Western magic. And this isn't anything new, but maybe for some of your viewers it might be new that, see, there's a kind of formula for self-transformation that applies in just about every system. And, the way that they do the formula is different, but the formula is the same. And the formula in the West, in Western magic, because of things that happened, because of the rise of Christianity and the kind of very sudden shift away from the pagan tradition and the Dark Ages and all kinds of other things, it lost some of the parts of that formula. And magicians realized that fairly early on, because even in the 16th and 17th century, you had people trying to rediscover it and find different ways to make up for those gaps. And in the start of the 20th century, you had Aleister Crowley bringing in elements of yoga and meditation into Western magic to make up for those gaps. And the I Ching. He was the first white man to use the I Ching that we know of. I decided to take a look then more seriously at Eastern spirituality. And I became initiated into a lineage, and I also studied Qigong, practiced meditation, all those things. Now, I have to say that there are people that call me Swamiji, and there are also people that call me Swami, but I've also been called the anti-Swami, because one of the things that happened after I went through all this, and after I had this kind of experience of awakening, we call it, when I started to teach, I looked at one of the biggest things you realize when you experience enlightenment is that everything people tend to assume about enlightenment is wrong. And there are a lot of people who sell spirituality in the common market, so to say, that are basing a persona on those wrong ideas, right? People expect a guru to be this little old man who's soft-spoken and gentle and, who speaks very slowly and stares long time into somewhere behind you in the distance, right? And who will do everything with this like quietness and gentleness, and we'll talk about gentle things and white light and whatever, right? And there's this entire, what I've called the satsang circuit of supposed teachers that go around, usually always to the same cities, right? Sedona and Byron Bay and places like that. And people pay $50 or whatever to sit and listen to him talk about quietness and things like that, right? So I've made a career out of popping pins into the balloons of people's little fantasies about what spirituality is, right? Because spirituality is a very challenging and very difficult process of self-transformation. And the role of the guru in that, the Swami, if you want to call it that, is to haunt your dreams and shake you till you wake up, right? So it's not about being a nice person, and it's about doing a great work, what it is that you need to do your part, not just for your spiritual evolution, but for the spiritual evolution of humanity as a whole.
So it sounds like what you're doing is you're kind of keeping it real, like kind of like asshole-ish, right?
I have been called that.
Hey, like I've been called so many things as well, because sometimes I feel as though when people tell you those nice, bright, love and light things, I kind of call it the Eckhart Tolle sort of thing.
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, right? So when people do that, like, and they leave whatever it is, the talk, and they're feeling so inspired, but then the next day and the day after that, they just go back into their regular life. But then you meet that asshole, and that asshole says something, it just, gets you. And then you just like ruminate over what they said for days and weeks, and that may be the change that you need. And I've often found that it may be the assholes that kind of move you towards the path. And in my life, it's been assholes, like usually guys I've dated who are assholes, have like led me down a spiritual path. So, I mean, I say own it, right? That asshole title.
Every genuine spiritual teacher in history was at some degree an asshole, all right? And the people that we think of as not assholes, like, Jesus or the Buddha, it's only because time has whitewashed them so much, right? I mean, consider the Buddha. The Buddha was the closest thing his culture, his society could have imagined to an antichrist. The guy came into this Brahminist society and he said, your whole caste system is wrong, your gods are fake, your whole system of reincarnation to try to, advance the higher stages, that's all bullshit. There's the only thing you can do is accept that existence is suffering. And, all of this stuff that you guys have been practicing is worthless, right? Like, that's why for centuries after that, there was persecution of Buddhists in India until eventually they just kind of vanished, right? Because it was like he was like the Richard Dawkins of 5th century BC India, right? He was a guy that was just completely in your face about shattering every little religious fantasy and religious dogma that the Brahminist Indian world had. And Jesus, I mean, even history hasn't been able to completely whitewash, his driving out the moneylenders with whips in the temple, right? So the money changers, I need to say. But he was a guy that was fierce, right? And you look at more recent gurus and the people who are like the biggest, most powerful, most change-inducing teachers in the 20th century in the various different traditions, the guys that really made an impact were all some degree of asshole, right? You have guys like Aleister Crowley, Gurdjieff. Gurdjieff famously drove away most of his students because he made it so difficult for them. You had Nisargadatta, you had Osho, you had all of these guys that were constantly doing stuff that forced you, as soon as you got comfortable with them, to challenge your understanding in some way. And usually by doing something that would put on your head your whole idea of this is what a guru is, this is what a guru does, this is what I do as a spiritual person, and this is what I have to do to be spiritual, and all of those sorts of things, right? Chögyam Trungpa, the only really decent traditional line Buddhist teacher of the 20th century, was a drunken lunatic. But he was an incredible teacher. He changed everything there.
So what happened before you were initiated? What sort of life were you leading?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. I was originally born in Canada, and I had a very comfortable sort of upper middle class childhood, you could say. And my family was very religious. They were very Catholic because they were an immigrant family to Canada, and they were strongly Catholic, and I was strongly Catholic as a kid. And then by the time I was about 16, I'd become an atheist. I'd rebelled against that. I'd reacted against it, and I just kind of rejected the whole thing, and I didn't believe in anything. And I was quite determined not to believe in anything for about 2 years. And then when I was 18, me and a friend of mine, a high school friend, we were just starting university, but we're going to the same university. We were walking around this one avenue in the city I was from, in Edmonton, that is kind of like got all the little trendy stores and things like that. And this was a guy who was interested, kind of in chasing girls and in, politics and some other stuff. But he wasn't a spiritual guy either. I mean, he was kind of very, very, Sunday Catholic, not Sunday, Christmas Catholic, right? He'd go on Christmas and Easter, but with his family, but that was it. He was not a spiritual thinking guy at all. But for some reason, he told me, we have to go into this store. And it was this kind of new age store. And I was like, okay, whatever. So I went in with him. And he was looking around. I don't even know what it is that drove him to go in there. I don't remember him purchasing anything. But I was walking around the store, and I saw that there was, in this one kind of basket, a deck of tarot cards. I'd never used tarot cards before. I had no interest in them. I had no experience with them. But I saw that deck, that box. It was a box that had an eye on it. And I just said, I have to buy that. I absolutely have to. It was just something that came from completely beyond me. And so I picked it up. I purchased it. And then after that, I started learning, well, what is this about? How do I do this, right? And everything just kind of spiraled from there. I changed my orientation in my history degree to the history of religion and eventually directly to the history of, occult movements in history, And that's what led me on the path initially. It was this moment that was a moment completely outside of any sense or reason. I think that those are the moments that for some reason, something triggers within ourselves that we have an opportunity to break out of our patterns when something like that happens. And it's the sort of thing that the I Ching talks about, right? The changing lines. You have changing lines and not changing lines when you cast the I Ching. And an unchanging line means this is a part of what's going on right now, because every hexagram in the I Ching represents what's going on right now. This is a part of what's going on right now that you can't change at all. But the changing lines are the part that you can change. They're flexible time as opposed to fixed time. And most of the times in those moments, people will be too caught up in their what in I Ching talk is the inferior person, right, in their own conditionings, to actually figure out how to do this.
The reason why I wanted to talk to you, and we were talking about this, I found you via your book, which is called The Magician's I Ching. And I was attracted to the title because it has the word magician in it, which, I definitely relate to, but also I Ching. And maybe for the audience who doesn't know anything about the I Ching or knows very little about it, if you had to give somebody like an elevator pitch on why they should learn about I Ching, what would you say?
On why they should learn about it, not on what it is, but just why they should learn about it.
Let's start with what it is and then why they should learn about it.
Okay. So the very, very short way of putting the I Ching is that it's the oldest continually used book in history. It's 3,000 years old. And it's a guide to understanding reality and to understanding yourself. And it was the foundation of all Chinese and therefore all other Asian philosophy. Taoism and Confucianism didn't exist at that time. When they were born, they were inspired by what was in the I Ching.
Would you say that then the I Ching, it's similar-ish to the Bible?
Well, the I Ching is in some ways similar to the Bible in that it's the foundational text. It's not like the Bible in that it's not a story, but it's the foundational text of Chinese spirituality. And you'll see all of these lines in the I Ching. Each hexagram, in a way, tells its own story. And those stories are all parables in some sense or another. And the lines in those I Ching hexagrams, they've become in many cases, common phrases used in China. They're like, knock on wood or something like that, right? A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, right? Those sorts of sayings. There are lines from the I Ching that are used as that kind of thing. The same way that we use biblical sayings in common English, they permeated every level of culture and society. And they're kind of the default model of how, along with the writings of Confucius, of proper social behavior in the Chinese and therefore to certain degrees in all the rest of the Asian world.
That's the I Ching, I guess, in like a very short nutshell, or a very small nutshell, should I say?
I haven't really. That's not really explaining how it works, but that's explaining what it is.
So, in a way, you've also explained why it's important that people look into it, because I know a lot of people in the West, it's like we just learned about Western history and stuff, but history in China is legit. It's long, it's legit, and it influenced the entire region.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an unchanging, not unchanging in the sense of not developing, in the sense that they never had a complete civilizational collapse that then changed completely into a different culture. Like with each dynasty and with the various crises that happened in Chinese history, you had changes, sometimes really big changes in Chinese culture and society. But it was still the same fundamental civilization for 3,000 years, from the time of the Zhou, which were the dynasty that wrote the I Ching, right up until the Communist Revolution. Chinese culture was a single thread, whereas in Europe you never had that. You had the Roman Empire, and then the Roman Empire collapsed, and then it became all kinds of other messy things, right? And what I'd say also about why people should study the I Ching, some of your viewers, I think, might be familiar with Western magic and Western divination and Western occultism and things like that. Well, I wrote the Magician's I Ching in part to make it easier for people who are into that to use the I Ching in a practical way, because a lot of translations of the I Ching are very, very academic, and they're not really focused for practical use. And the ones that claim to be focused for practical use tend to be kind of new agey, or just they're very, very light. And this is something that is keeping to the heaviness of the text, but making a total focus on practical use. Now, the I Ching, a lot of people think it's just kind of like the tarot of China, but it's a lot more than that. And if you're a Western occultist, what you have to understand is that it's not just like the tarot. It's like the Kabbalah of China, right? It's like the fundamental framework of everything that you see in Asian magic. Apart from maybe a few things that date back to like the pre-I Ching shamanism and stuff like that. But in like, especially the high magic, the equivalent of like the kind of Western high magic, the magic that had to do not with curses and blessings and stuff like that, but with the transformation of the self, and being able to speak to gods and command demons and all that sort of stuff. That's all based on the I Ching. Yes, the Chinese astrology is based on the I Ching. Feng Shui is based on the I Ching. Qigong, and what today is called Qigong, but was really other things before that. And by extension, all Chinese martial arts are in some way originally based on the I Ching. So the I Ching is much more fundamental than just a divination system. And most people in the West and in China just use it kind of for fortune telling. But in occult schools and in occult kind of mysteries and what have you, in China and other parts of Asia, the I Ching is used as the basic working tools of Chinese magic.
See, I had never even heard about the I Ching being a sort of a philosophical school or a cosmological sort of viewpoint. I had only known about I Ching as you like throw some sticks and then you like create these lines, and some lines are like dashes and some lines are straight, and then you like look up in a chart like what it means, and then that means that you should like put money here, like that's the only thing that I knew about I Ching. And I think that's probably like the bulk of even Asian society, as you mentioned.
Yeah. That's
how they use it. So how did you, as a Westerner, learn about this, and not just the surface level, but like really deep into the I Ching?
As I said, in university, I had started to get deeply involved in the Western occult. And I was particularly drawn to the kind of magical system of Aleister Crowley, because I saw that he was like not talking about magic just for kind of some kind of helping your life sort of way, but in the sense of actual, serious transformation, spiritual transformation. And that was something that interested me. And I got to reading the diaries of Crowley and discovered that Crowley actually very rarely used the tarot. If you look at his diaries, he would only very occasionally do tarot readings, but he was constantly using the I Ching, even though he didn't really know how to use it right, because there, at the time that he was alive, right, we're talking about, his diaries are from the 1910s and the 1920s, right? At that time, there was no edition of the I Ching that actually contained the method of doing an I Ching casting. So he was guessing based on, or kind of interpreting based on stuff that he saw in China when he went all across China on a donkey in 1905, I think it was 1905, 1906, something like that. And he was interpreting kind of that system. He made up his own way of reading the I Ching using 6 sticks, and it was actually pretty close. It wasn't bad. I mean, it's not nearly as sophisticated as the Yarrow method, which is.
That means that the bottom is mountain or earth. The bottom trigram, that is. And so far, no changing lines.
Method, which is the real kind of method using the 50 euro stocks that you have in the I Ching. But he even then, even with such a limited ability to study the I Ching, Crowley got right away that it was hugely important. He was using it on a really constant basis. And he famously did the Thoth tarot deck, and then he did the Book of Thoth, and he wrote those quite late in life. And the next thing he was planning to do was an equivalent version of the I Ching, but he actually died before he completed it. Very unfortunate for the world, I think. But when I saw all about Crowley's own interest in the I Ching, I said, well, I've got to check this out. And I picked up, I think the first version that I picked up was, it wasn't even the Wilhelm translation, but it was one of these academic translations that was very dry. And then I checked out the Wilhelm, and the Wilhelm version is better, which is probably the best sold English version of the I Ching, but it's still an extremely academic perspective, right? And it was very difficult to read and to understand as a near total beginner. Eventually, I found another translation of the I Ching, the Blofeld translation, the one by John Blofeld, which was very popular in the 1960s. And that's a very good translation, though it's very bare bones. It's just kind of the raw material of the hexagrams with no real explanation, except a very brief introduction of how to do a casting, and that's it. But just from that, I was like very, very drawn into it. And I began to study it. And that was, 24 years ago, I guess now. I'm old. And so I started studying the I Ching from there. But my I Ching studies were always kind of from the point of view of using it as a divination tool in the way I use the tarot. Until I got to that point when I was, when I got out of my master's program and became initiated, became a Swami. I had gone to Vancouver to practice these meditation techniques, which are not Chinese. My Swami is not a Chinese title; it's an Indian title, and I was doing stuff that was basically tantrism, you could say. But I was living literally a block south of Vancouver's Chinatown. Vancouver has the second biggest Chinatown in North America. Only San Francisco is bigger, and it's just quite an amazing place. And I had already been learning a little bit of Qigong before I got there, and so I decided to go look to learn some really serious Qigong I had hoped to find with a teacher. And I did find a teacher, and then he led me to another teacher. And this other teacher was talking a little bit about the I Ching in ways that I had never really experienced. And he was talking about the I Ching in the context kind of esoteric Neo-Confucianism, the closest thing to Western high magic that you see in Chinese culture. And I was very fascinated by that. And at the same time, I got familiar enough in Chinatown. I became, because at first it was very challenging, among the kind of the locals to be seen as something other than a tourist. I had to learn how to play Zhangqi, Chinese chess. And that was really, I think that was a turning point, was when I was at the Vancouver night market and I was playing Chinese chess against Chinese people. They were just fascinating. There was no kind of concern at that time. I don't think there would be today either about something like cultural appropriation, because they understood. They felt kind of like very, very happy that here was this white guy that had such respect and honored their own culture and their own tradition, that they were very, they were pleased. They thought it was curious. But that kind of, when they saw that I was taking it seriously and that I wasn't just kind of screwing around, I started to get more inroads there. And I started to run into also a lot of the kind of the fortune tellers that were there in Chinatown, which were not kind of highbrow guys. They were fortune tellers, just like fortune tellers anywhere in the world, that are, very practical guys. And in every culture except maybe modern Western culture, fortune tellers, tarot readers or palm readers or I Ching or whatever, you don't go to them to learn about kind of like your psychological state or to get some kind of vague thing about, oh, things are going well for you, but kind of whatever. No. People go because they're like, I want to know if my son is going to get married this year, right? Or I want to know if I'm going to get pregnant and if it's going to be a boy, right? And stuff like this, right? I want to know if I can get that raise at this job, right? Like very, very specific stuff, but they have to have very specific answers to. And so I discovered at the same time that while I was looking at this kind of high tradition of what the I Ching is, there was this low tradition, you could say, the street side fortune tellers. And they had totally different methods because a lot of them never even used the book, the text itself. They just worked with the hexagrams and interpreted the elements of the hexagrams and the lines and their positions. And they would never look at the book because these came from traditions where a lot of the people who were using this were illiterate, so they couldn't read the book. All they could do is, by kind of process of memory and word of mouth, learn how to interpret the lines and their positions and the trigrams and the elements to be able to tell a very practical fortune. And so I kind of got the best of both worlds there. That opened my eyes. I saw, okay, there's a whole bunch of stuff about the I Ching as divination that has never been published in any Western book. And there's a whole bunch of stuff about the I Ching as not just divination, but as a system for self-transformation and as a system for understanding reality itself, space and time, that almost every book has failed to talk about in the West.
That's the most fascinating part. Is, okay, you can definitely find books, like tons and tons of books about how to interpret the hexagrams for divination. But this idea of using the I Ching for magic, well, let's just forget, using it for, personal transformation and alchemy and esoteric texts about that. I can sort of understand, like even tarot can be used for inner alchemy and stuff. But it's just like when I learned that people were using tarot, like the actual cards and like the energies around them for magic, that kind of blew my mind. And now learning that the I Ching can also be used for magic. And when I think of magic, I think of less, oh, I'm just going to accept fate. And magic is a little bit more, well, the energy seems to be moving this way. I want it to move a little bit more this way. How can we close that gap? How does a person use I Ching as a magical tool?
Well, in the first place, it's kind of like you say that, because I think that you have to use, if you're going to use magic effectively, you have to be going through a process of what in kind of the Chinese culture they call cultivation, what we could call, I guess, practice. That you're doing a daily process of meditation and exercises that are internal exercises on yourself, inner alchemy, right? So at the very least, you have to kind of be meditating, and you have to be, or doing, yoga or concentration exercise or something like that.
Why?
Because your ability to change reality depends on your ability to perceive reality beyond your normal boundaries. Okay, so it's a bit like the movie The Matrix, right?
No.
That the people who don't know that they're in the Matrix can't do anything to change anything, right? The people that know that they're not, that they're in the Matrix, can then re-enter the Matrix and do stuff. And then Neo, who sees the code that's behind all the Matrix, can do just about anything. So your awareness is the driving force for your ability to create change in reality, your ability to create change in the world. This is why, and it makes it very difficult for some people who feel impatient and just really want to be able to, I don't know, use magic to get money and wealth and power or whatever, right? And I've had students that were coming to me and they're like, yeah, I want to change my life. I want to, get a better job or whatever. And I'm like, well, okay, but this isn't really about that. This is about transforming yourself, right? And then you'll see what it is you really want to do. Because the problem is you don't really know what you want to change until you know yourself, right? That was the point of the sign at the entrance to the Oracle of Delphus, right? Know thyself, right? Until you know yourself, you don't know what questions to ask, right? You don't know. You can't even do divination because you don't really know what are the truly important things that you want to or need to know until you've looked within yourself. So that's essential. But then you can do that internal practice, and then you can also do external things in the world. And doing external things in the world are done through a couple of different aspects to them, because there has to be one aspect which is about living out in an ordinary way the change that's going on within you. Because you could be having all these wonderful spiritual experiences and you're seeing gods and angels and devils and all this stuff, and if you don't change at all in the world, then you're just hallucinating, right? There's nothing that's actually going on. So you have to develop what in the I Ching is termed virtue, and this is a fundamental part of any cultivation practice that comes from Asian magic, and it's implied in the very first line of the I Ching, because there's this the first line of the I Ching is Yuan Hong Li Jun, which means divine celestial forces in motion, and this is the essence of virtue. Virtue in Mandarin, I guess it would be, is de, which is it means power, but it also means virtue. So how virtuous you are determines how powerful you are. This isn't morality like virtue in the sense of being a nice person. These are certain specific traits that you have to develop that gives you an ability to do good in the world, but also to use your power to change things in the world. And the four primary sort of traits represented by Yuan Hong Li Shen are your discipline, your harmony or balance, right? How internally balanced you are, how disciplined you are as a person, your truth, your ability to both be truthful and to see what is true, and then union, which is your ability to be connected to everything that's around you, right? To be connected to the universe, you could say, which is also union and love are synonyms, right? So it's your ability to connect to other people and your ability to connect to the environment and to the world. So only when you can do those things can you then really effectively do magic. And then when you have been doing those things, when you have been cultivating, magic becomes much easier. It's just a matter of learning these elements and being able to manipulate them through ritual forms. In the I Ching, the elements are represented by the 8 trigrams, which are the 8 building blocks of reality. Reality starts with just pure emptiness, which is which is Wu. And then it turns into a complete and absolute isness, a oneness, which is called Tai Chi, right? Which is where, which is what we usually think of as the yin yang symbol, right? That's the Tai Chi, the white and the black mixed together inside of a circle. And that white and black, which are at first completely part of that oneness, but then divide into two, are yin and yang. And the yin and yang then break up into four, which are the four primal forces of reality, which are also connected to the four virtues. So when you're connecting to those virtues, you're tapping into a deeper, a higher, or more fundamental level of reality that lets you then manipulate things. And those four primal forces divide into the 8 elements. There's 4 celestial elements and 4 terrestrial elements. And the way that they've been translated in most I Ching translations sometimes makes it difficult to note this, but the lower 4 are basically the 4 elements of Western magic as well: earth, air, fire, and water. And then the higher 4 are the moon, the sun, the world, and heaven. So these are the powers that you can then work with. And the way that this magic is worked with is to me very interesting, because different schools in history have applied them in different ways. So there were the schools that incorporated this into Qigong to make it into a very physical kind of magic that involved movement and stepping and the use of different mudras, positions of the hands, that were all meant to invoke different forces: earth, air, fire, and water. Exactly, right. And to invoke the celestial forces. And there were schools that used this for they used the I Ching kind of like a grimoire, where they would use different hexagrams to connect to different spirits or different demons, right? And then there were other schools that used the basis of the trigrams or the hexagrams to make talismans that you would empower to do different tasks, right? And there were many different ways of creating these different talismans. So these were all parts of I Ching related magic that came up in the West. And really all of Qigong, and that includes stuff that came out of Qigong, which included kind of like acupuncture and all that stuff, started as I Ching based magic, right? The foundations of Qigong were what was from a school called the School of Yin and Yang, that came up sometime around the time of Confucius, so about 500 BC, possibly a little earlier, possibly a little later, we're not sure. But they were, this was a school that taught movements that allowed you to affect the balance of your qi, your yin and your yang within yourself, and then to be able to use this, often in conjunction with the elements, to create changes on the outside. In particular, they used it for things like healing, but you could also use it for things like harming. And a lot of the so-called internal martial arts came out of that tradition. So all of this stuff, right? Like I said, Chinese astrology, and also feng shui, which in the West today we think of as like rearranging your furniture in your house, to get good qi or something like that. That's not really what feng shui was, right? Like feng shui worked originally as a system to determine where to construct. First of all, it was tombs, the tombs of kings, right? That's what feng shui was used for, because tombs were very important in the time of the Zhou Dynasty. So you had to have the right place to put your tomb. It was super important for all kinds of religious reasons. And feng shui, again, uses the 8 elements. It uses the Bagua circle. If you get a feng shui compass today, the trigrams and sometimes even the hexagrams of the I Ching are on that compass, so that a feng shui expert can look based on the compass and determine, which of the hexagrams rules the direction in which the position is located that you're thinking of building something or putting something, right?
Okay, so I'm still trying to ground the I Ching into the sort of like historical context and everything. So if everything comes from the I Ching, who wrote it? Where does it come from?
Okay. So this is a more complicated question than it looks, because the I Ching didn't have one single author. In the first place, we're fairly sure that the method of the I Ching was not something that was just suddenly invented. It was something that gradually evolved. But there's a lot of mythology about it in China, about how the I Ching happened. And some of that mythology we know isn't right, because there's stuff that they attribute. For example, that there's the Bagua circle, the circle that has the 8 trigrams arranged in it. And there's one that's called the King Wen circle, or the later heaven circle. And then another one that's called the Fuji circle, or the earlier heaven circle. And that one supposedly was created by Fuji. Fuji was the legendary founder, the culture founder. Really, he was like the first man, right? And so this is an idea that has been a part of kind of Chinese mythology about the I Ching, that Fuji, the first real dude, right? The one that there's this whole story about him in Chinese history about how in his time people were different, right? They're kind of innocent. They had no understanding of things. They didn't know where babies came from. They didn't know how to farm. They didn't know. They didn't have marriage. They didn't know how to tend livestock. They didn't know how to do any of these things. But Fuji was a particularly clever dude, and he was told that there was this flood coming that was going to bury the whole world, right? Just like, the flood myth is all over the place, right? And so Fuji took his sister, Nuwa, and the two of them fled to the top of a holy mountain. And the flood came and killed everybody else. But Fuji and his sister survived. So they got married, and that's how you started. That was the beginning of marriage, right? Which was one of the many things he invented. And then he invented farming, and then he invented animal husbandry and all this sort of stuff. And according to legend, Fuji also discovered the 8 trigrams when a turtle came out of the river and it had markings of the 8 trigrams on its back. And he kind of realized that the 8 elements, that the trigrams represented the 8 elements, and how that this let you understand nature. And so this allowed him to do things like knowing when to plant crops and when to, how to go through all the cycle of the year and farming and all that. So it's a legend, right? And it's a legend that kind of tries to explain how these symbols were meant to represent these ideas that were fundamental for ancient people to understand how to live. And what we know, we don't know exactly when the trigrams really started being used, but we know that there was something similar, to the I Ching that was going on before the I Ching existed as a book. Now, in the time of the end of the Shang Dynasty, which was really the first real dynasty, because there were other legendary dynasties of China. If you ask the Chinese, they have thousands and thousands of years more history. That's all kind of legendary history, the Yellow Emperor and all these guys. But the first dynasty of China that we can actually prove really existed was called the Shang Dynasty. And the Shang Dynasty ruled for, we're not sure exactly how long, but probably several hundred years, up until 1100 BC. And the Shang Dynasty, they were ruled by these kind of priest kings or wizard kings. It was one of the central things, we know it was one of the central things of their civilization, was divination. And they did divination by taking a turtle shell and putting it over a flame until it cracked. And then they would look at the lines that those cracks formed and interpret those lines to determine the future. And this was hugely important to them in their rituals. They did this all the time. And in archaeological digs, we found, unbelievable amounts of these turtle shells. And very convenient for us, they even would write the question that was being asked in the divination. And then in a lot of them, it even says, did it turn out or not, right? It says, this didn't come true, or this happened, or stuff like that, right? So there was all varieties of questions, and in the Shang period, this clearly helped guide them in kind of how to do their civilization. So I think they're kind of learning how to interpret this system of divination in a way to evolve, right? To evolve their civilization. But they eventually fell into decadence. And you can even see this in, again, the archaeological evidence of these turtle shells, because in the early period of the Shang, you'd see these questions that were about all kinds of things, and you got all kinds of answers, right? So it was will the king have a son? And the answer is no, the king won't have a son, or the king will have a son, but it will die very young, or stuff like this. Stuff that wasn't always good news, right? And by the end of the Shang Dynasty, the divinations were all saying the same thing. Everything is great, and all is well, and there's great success coming, right? So you could, when you get that, you know that it turned into propaganda, right? And that this was a dynasty that was in trouble, because if you have to keep being told again and again and again, everything's wonderful, you don't have to change anything, it means that something's actually really wrong. Now, the Shang had all kinds of vassal states that were around them, these lesser tribes that they had conquered. And they governed over all of them. But when the last Shang emperor came along, who was an absolute lunatic, really. He was like, if you know the stories of like Nero or Caligula, the last Shang emperor fits right in with them, right? He would kill people just for fun. He would torture them in unbelievable ways. He'd like have them sat on these sharp razors until they were cut in half. He would, decapitate people just because. And he spent all of the treasury of the dynasty on building this enormous, beautiful palace that was filled with gold. And in the middle of the palace, he had like this miniature lake of wine. And in the center of the lake, he had an island that had trees made out of sticks with deer meat on them. And they would have these lavish orgies there. And then they would like kill people for fun at these lavish orgies. It was just all this stuff. They just couldn't believe it. It was just unbelievably villainous and corrupt. Now, part of this might be propaganda of the next dynasty that overthrew him, right? But there's enough reason to think he must have been doing something wrong, right? So one of these vassal tribes was called the Zhou, and their leader was a chief named Wen. And he had been a very faithful subject of the Shang for a long time, and he even helped kind of try to stop revolt or rebellion from happening. At least that's, again, the official story, right? But this also ties into this Chinese notions about loyalty and the importance of obeying superiors and all that. It all has a very cultural element to it. But he went, according to the legend, he went to the Shang Emperor, and he was pleading with the Shang Emperor to show moderation. And the Shang Emperor put him in jail, right? He was imprisoned. And Chief Wen was a very studious person, and the Zhou also had divination, and they used divination with lines, right, which were the lines of the I Ching. And King Wen, while he was in jail, decided to write a description, a book about the 64 hexagrams that you can form with those lines, with those 6 lines. And this was the very start of the I Ching. That was the first part of it, where he put each of the hexagrams and their descriptions. King Wen died, and then all of his sons, rose up a revolt. They united all the different vassal tribes. They went into the palace. They burned it down. They killed the last Shang emperor, and King Wen's oldest surviving son became the new king, the first emperor of the Zhou dynasty, which was the dynasty that succeeded. And the Chief Wen became a posthumous king because of that. And one of the king's younger sons, Duke Zhu, he took his father's book and expanded on it by adding the descriptions of the 6 lines for each of the hexagrams. Again, this is the legend. What may have really happened is that this was a very, very important sort of divination system of the Zhou. And part of all this legend is also to suggest that the Zhou were much more moral, more virtuous than the Shang. And part of it was also something that you see that there was a better technology, a better divination technology, because the Shang, for their divination technology, you needed the king. The king had to get the turtle shell. He was a vital part of the process. And then it was very difficult. Only the people who had the special powers, only the wizard priests could interpret the turtle shells, right? But the Zhou, they invented a system that anyone could use. And this was like a huge breakthrough, right? It was like the difference from the point of view of kind of divination technology, if you want to call it that. It was a revolution. It was like the difference between calligraphy in monasteries and the printing press, right? Suddenly everybody could do divination. And so the Zhou, probably what happened was that at the beginning of the Zhou dynasty, they actually got a bunch of scribes together and they worked out what the text was going to be. But this got attributed, of course, to the royal family because, you always do that. You always say, well, it was actually, King Wen did it and then his son finished it, right? So this is the core text of the I Ching. The part that most people think of in the West today as the I Ching is those two parts, the part that King Wen did and the part that Duke Zhu did. And they're actually, most Western I Ching translations have only those parts in them, except some of the more academic ones like the Wilhelm translation, which add in what became the third vital part, which are the Confucian commentaries, which didn't happen until more than 600 years later, right? So we're talking about 500 BC. When Confucius comes along, the I Ching was already ancient, was already as old to him as the tarot is to us, right? That's how long it had been around. And again, according to legend, Confucius studied the I Ching seriously only when he was kind of past middle age. And he was supposed to have said that if I had only a few more years to live, I'd dedicate 60 of them to studying the I Ching, right? As if to say, you can never study it enough. There's always these layers upon layers of it. Historically, there's a lot of debate as to whether Confucius actually ever talked about or studied the I Ching. Because the Analects, which are his most famous texts, they don't even register there, right? And he actually kind of talks against divination there. So, but the Confucian commentaries, which are attributed to Confucius, certainly came out of that school of Confucian thinking that probably happened after his death. So if it wasn't literally Confucius talking about it, it was people who were inspired by Confucius talking about it and then attributing it to Confucius. So what was clear is that the Confucian school embraced the I Ching, but they embraced it because they realized that it wasn't just about telling fortune, which was where it started, but or learning how, giving a guide to statecraft, which was what the Zhu used it for, right? Like how to be a good king. But they realized it was also about how to transform yourself as a person, right? The part that Confucius really changes is he adds the part that in my book, in the hexagrams, I call, the commentary, but also the part that I call the great work, which is where for every hexagram, he says, when this hexagram comes up, this is what the superior individual would do, right? So the superior individual is that part of yourself that is your higher self, as opposed to the inferior person, which is the lower self. In a lot of other translations, they call it the great man and the lesser man, or something like that, right? Or the low man and the high man, or stuff like that. But I decided to call it the inferior person, as in the persona, the fake personality of yourself, of who you think you are when you're ignorant, right? When you're not being conscious, versus the true superior individual, the self that you are when you're being conscious, when you discover your individuality. And so you'll get a hexagram, hexagram number 28. I'm just kind of peeking at my book here. Excess, right? And the description of it is the beam sags, it cannot hold. It's good to have a goal. And then the great work, it says, the superior individual, although alone, is free from fear. He has no trouble withdrawing from the world, right? So the meaning of the hexagram is that it's saying that there's too much pressure, excess weight, right? And that things are going to collapse, they're going to break. And so you have to either move forward or prop things up or back up, because this isn't going to last where you're at, right? And so that's stuff that you can apply to a situation when you're asking about, I don't know, my work or something like that. How are things at my job? Well, if you get hexagram 28, there's probably a stressful situation and something's going to fall apart there, right? If you're not very, very careful. So you can get guidance to how to do that right. But in terms of the self, there's also this question of this choice you're making of how are you going to act in that situation? Are you going to be the best possible person you can be in that situation? Or are you going to be, a kind of crappy version of yourself and do things wrong and mess it up more, right? So this was what Confucius, or the Confucian school, was really interested in, is how, since the I Ching measures every single moment of time, part of what Confucius believed in was that in every single moment, we're constantly faced with this choice. Are we going to be the superior individual, or are we going to be the inferior person? Are we going to be the worst of ourselves, or are we going to be the best of ourselves? And you can choose every time, every single moment. So the I Ching, he wrote the commentaries, or the commentaries that were written in his name, are basically an elaboration of how to use the I Ching for that process of self-transformation to individualize, right? In a way, it's kind of the world's first psychology book, but it's, a really profound spiritual psychology. I don't know. Did I answer the question, or did I go crazy there?
No, now I feel as though, okay, that makes total sense. So it started off more as like a bunch of ancient people trying to feel a sense of control by using a divination system. And then because China has this long, unbroken sort of history, then there were layers upon layers on top of that, more sophisticated thinking that went on top of that.
And the I Ching doesn't really stop as a book with Confucius. What happened was that it became canonized. It became one of the 5 classics, they called it, at the time of the true, the beginning of the imperial China, when it was determined that, the imperial school for bureaucrats, because China was actually for a while at least, a very meritocratic system of government, where it didn't matter who you were, if you could pass the examinations, you could become a civil officer, and civil officers could eventually become governors and very important things. So it was based purely on your merit. I mean, in theory. In practice, I'm sure there was bribery and stuff like that happened, right? Like everywhere. But this was part of what Confucius brought to China, was this idea that everybody has the potential to be the superior individual. So we have to educate everybody. So it had, much more widespread education than you saw in other parts of the world. And then everybody has a chance, potentially, to rise up to whatever their their true will lead them to, right? Whatever their greatest potential should be. So just because you were born a peasant doesn't mean you should live like a peasant. You should have a chance to see if you should be, a general or a governor or something like that, right? Or a judge or whatever. And it should be based on your studies and your abilities. So the question was, how do we grade this, right? Because this was the Confucian system was really amazing. People think of it, they think of Chinese philosophy and of Confucian philosophy as being something that was all about conformity and all about the collective, right? People in the West, there's especially this mentality that, the Chinese are just, they don't even think in terms of individuals. They always think about the family and the group and the state and stuff like that. And that's not right. There's a different emphasis placed on the importance. The thing that's central in kind of Asian philosophy is that you're not the center of the world, right? As opposed to in the West, where people, Western individualism, part of that says you're the center of the world. But Eastern individualism is different. It says only by what Confucius did is he taught only by discovering yourself as an individual can you serve the rest of humanity, right? And so your individualism is in the service of humanity, but it's absolutely individualistic, right? And that's why Confucianism beat these other schools that came at the same time that were saying, no, the individual doesn't matter, or only the king matters, or only the collective matters. No, it's an individualist system. And so they started this training for civil servants. And they said, well, we have to test them. And they tested them on 5 books, which were called the 5 classics. And one of those 5 books was the I Ching, as it then existed. So that meant that after that, anything else that was written to add to the I Ching was not part of the official I Ching. It was just kind of like additional commentaries. But there were additional commentaries. There was huge amounts for the next, 2,000 years after the start of that period, where every great philosopher of China said something about the I Ching, and most of its poets said something about the I Ching. And so you have the work of guys like Xiao Yong, right, and some of the Zhu Xi, who wrote volumes of these profound things that add to the way you can understand the I Ching, but that are never, ever found in a I Ching translation in the West.